everyone. Welcome to the Fuel the Fight podcast. Glad you joined us today. Another outstanding episode with another outstanding guest. We have Bria Morris, Aerospace Physiologist with KBR over at Brooks here in San Antonio. Going to talk to us today. We'll talk a little altitude physiology and talk about her background. Bria, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, where I want to first start off, because we met at the tactical annual training for the National Strength and Conditioning Association that was just here in San Antonio, I guess a few weeks back now. Mm-hmm. But your military connection, your military story, because I have folks on here and I usually have them tell their Army story, but you have an interesting, unique kind of connection to the military. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, so came into the military kind of late in life. My dad joined when I was about 10 years old, right after 9/11, so he joined late in life as well. Army National Guard, went into infantry, and he's actually currently being deployed right now, still to this day, so we're still in that life. But that opened up, our lifestyle before he joined the military was very physically fit, good nutrition oriented. It probably got even worse once he joined the Army. Lots of, hey, I had to do this drill, so now you're going to have to do it too. Or, can you carry this and things like that. So I still do the fitness test practice with him and things like that whenever I'm home. But with that, it always inspired me. I always had an interest in extreme environments and the stress that they put on the body, but especially learning from him some of the things that different Army units go through, especially when they're out in field training, particularly heat stroke, dehydration, all of that. I couldn't believe that it was still occurring at the rates that really it is, and with that it kind of opened me up to a world of opportunity through my schooling and through that into things that I could focus on to help the military and the government moving forward as my career as a civilian.
Nice. And so, you saw your dad going through that, and it's awesome you do the Army Combat Fitness Test with him. Do you have an athletic background? Did you play sports? Or
Not in college, just,
okay.
Growing up throughout recreational sports, high school sports, that kind of thing.
Okay.
But I was never that good.
I'm sure you're selling yourself short, but so kind of seeing that, you decided that's what drove you to go into physiology, or was that kind of your passion?
Yeah, that was a lot. You're deciding your junior, senior year of high school what to do. And so while I was deciding, looking at different opportunities, I realized playing sports and looking at nutrition, I was having a lot more fun mapping out my nutrition and finding out, the fiber content, calorie content of an apple versus doing math, there's math involved, but doing different types of sciences. I always knew it was going to be science oriented, but that definitely struck me as, well, if I'm doing this in my free time, I might as well try to do this for my career and have fun with it. So then I went and got my bachelor's degree in nutrition science.
So you got your bachelor's in nutrition science, and then was there any break, or did you get right into your master's?
I went right into my master's.
And then remind me, where was that at?
Cal State Long Beach.
Okay, Cal State Long Beach. And then after you got your master's, what do you get into after that?
After I got my master's in ex-phys and nutrition, I went on to a medical device company, more body composition. Mm-hmm. So that was a lot of fun. I was a bioelectrical impedance device company, and I was one of their clinical research specialists. So what that role does is essentially we answer all your questions. So anytime anybody types in and has a question about why this happened, why their results came out this way, we answered all of that. But our greater project was reaching out to universities and different research groups and getting them to incorporate studies that maybe we needed to prove more in a different area so that we could sell the device or understand more about the device. And that was awesome because it expanded everything from, I got to talk to professional sports teams to clinics. I went and presented at the renal dietitians conference, things like that. So it gave the full spectrum between critical care and sport, and how, especially with biological impedance being so focused on hydration status, that was kind of the main connection between them all, which was pretty cool.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that was really exciting in terms of like getting that deep into the science of body comp, and then especially utilizing something like bioelectrical impedance that imagine everybody's using at some point,
Right.
just because of the accessibility. Not everybody can have an X-ray scan done on that. So then from there, how do you get into aerospace physiology? Or was there something in between, or was it?
No, it was a big jump. Essentially, I decided I want to get back into research, so I knew it was going to be with the military in some way or another. So as jobs came up, I just applied, and then eventually this opportunity here in San Antonio came up, and luckily the exercise physiology background is a good fit for the same stressors that occur in the fighter cockpit. So they took me on and trained me, and now I'm here.
Yeah, and this is where we're getting into the meat. I'm getting excited about this because when we first sat down and you were talking to me about what you do, my mind was blown because this is so cool. So you're working with pilots in terms of in these extreme environments. Can you talk about the altitude chambers and the human centrifuge?
Yes.
In the work that you do there.
Yes, absolutely. And common mistake, as I said when we first met, on the human centrifuge. Everybody thinks blood centrifuge. So I always kind of like to start off with history because I guess that's the way I was told. So we adopted a lot of the equipment when Brooks City Base bracked in 2011 as our site for KBR. And so we maintain all of that equipment that was left over during the brack, including the altitude chambers and the human centrifuge. And so what we do there is really anything you could imagine with that equipment. We do training, as I mentioned to you, for the U.S. Navy and Marines, for the pilots for their acceleration training. If government altitude chambers are down, for example, the chambers over at Beale were flooded for a while, so we got to train the U-2 pilots for 2 years while that got repaired for their altitude exposures and their pressure suit testing. But on our own, we'll do essentially a lot of projects. We'll get life support systems that need testing in the chambers and the centrifuge to see how the OBOG systems, the different systems, are exposed to those environments, make sure that they're testing within the military standards. And then we focus on human performance as well. So we kind of always have these dual components of the equipment and the person and how they're doing in those different environments, which is pretty cool.
It's awesome. Can you talk a little bit about the chambers and their capabilities, like how high they can go, and then you have the one that controls the temperature, and so how low and how high can that go?
So we actually have, I think I told you 4 or 5 chambers operational. Three of them are for people. Some of them are smaller for equipment and much more rapid exposures that we wouldn't want people involved in. But for the most part, all of our chambers go up to 100,000, 120,000 feet. They're rated.
Wow.
Generally, with people, we do go very high. We do go higher than most, depending on the needs of the test and how high the aircraft's flying. We have taken people up to about 60,000 feet. Or higher. As I told you, we did that Red Bull stratosphere jump where we did take Felix Baumgartner up to 120,000 feet in his capsule, and then simulated the jump before he actually did it for all to see. But yeah, so those chambers, they can go way up high. And then, as you mentioned, they have all varieties. So we have a training chamber that we can actually fit multiple people in. I believe it's up to 9. And we can train crews together so that they understand their hypoxia symptoms, understand what might happen to them, the pressure changes, the fogging, the things that happen when you go to altitude, the cold. And then with that, we do have an environmental chamber that has an extreme cold component. It can go down to negative 70 degrees Fahrenheit, and then it heats up to, and I always get this wrong, but about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And with that, we can control the humidity and everything like that. So we can use that to simulate simulate a whole variety of conditions in that chamber. It's big enough to fit. I believe in the past they've just driven Humvees right in.
Wow.
Yeah, to do the testing. So we can look at camping equipment. There's treadmills, things like that, to look at different options, different physical activity in that environment. And then you have the added plus of the hypobaric or high altitude exposures.
Wow. So a lot of capabilities here in San Antonio.
Yes.
Didn't even know. Yeah. You can go high altitude in San Antonio. Very cool. So you mentioned, the Red Bull project, which is awesome. Were there any other like memorable kind of projects you can discuss?
Yeah, I mean, not in extreme detail.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, we've had the opportunity to definitely work with some jump groups and experience, make sure that they're safe and that their equipment is safe with them when they're jumping. We work with NASA on their X-59 low sonic boom plane that they're building, the Quest. So that's actually still in progress. They're going to flight test that, I believe, next year. But we did all of the equipment testing to make sure it was fine. And then with our human subjects, we actually put them in at those altitudes and the exposures to simulate what would happen and to be able to simulate an emergency of a rapid decompression, which could happen, if there's a hole or the plane is compromised in some sort of way. So we've worked with them for quite a while on that. We had the opportunity to assist in some of the F-18 UPE, unexplained physiological event investigations that have been ongoing with some of the things that have been happening throughout the Navy and Air Force. So we do touch on a lot of the equipment that gets distributed and get to answer definitely a lot of questions. We also have had the opportunity to work with the Defense Innovation Unit, who's focusing on a sensor suite to monitor pilots in the cockpit. So they're also very open about what they do because that's the point. But they're integrating a lot of civilian sensor equipment into a sensor suite to monitor the pilot in real time while they're in the cockpit so that they get alerts if their SpO2 drops or if different things happen so that they get warned that they're in trouble or something might be compromised, and then hopefully or perhaps somebody else on the ground will get warned that that pilot's in trouble too.
Yeah, if there were signs that maybe they're going to lose consciousness or something like that, you could pick that up ahead of time. And then I imagine that's also important to make sure these civilian sensors can withstand those type of forces or those type of environments.
Yes. It's always funny. Sometimes people ask, well, do you have this that's G tested? Like nothing comes, from the manufacturer tested to 9 Gs. We always just have to ask, we're going to put this in the centrifuge, and if it breaks, it breaks. That's the experiment to find out.
Only one way to find out.
That's one of the investment features. Same thing with the altitude chamber. Nothing can be fan cooled really as that's in the chamber. So we'll always check it before, especially if it's something worn, to make sure there's no fire risk. Because as you can imagine, being in a essentially metal box with not a lot of air density and a fire going off is not a good day. So we always check for that as well.
Wow, I didn't even think about it. Yeah, I mean that's what's so fascinating to me is like there's so many kind of these unique situations for these environments that normally you wouldn't think of. With the human centrifuge, because I want to touch on that since I just watched finally watched the second Top Gun this weekend. So what is the max like G's you're putting a human under in that?
So normally it's 9 Gs. Way back when the centrifuge was Air Force property, I believe in the 90s, they did do a 12 G extended study. There's videos of that on YouTube for sure. And the people who went through it were troopers, definitely. But yeah, usually we max out with people at 9 Gs, and then equipment generally will be about 15 to 20.
And then 9 Gs. Are there physiological adaptation or characteristics of some individuals that just can't take it, or is this all trainable? Can you always train somebody to get the 9Gs?
I think it's trainable. There's a lot of folklore or rumors around, you know, you have to be short and stout and things like that, have a thick lower body. I mean, that helps. I'm not going to lie. But we've also, we recruit, as I mentioned, research subjects throughout the San Antonio area that aren't flight crew, and we train them for this experience. So some of our research subjects do fit that profile just naturally. Or we've had, you know, somebody who's 6'4" and 190 pounds be able to pull G's better than sometimes some of the smaller, shorter people. We've had, you know, just skinny, shorter people come in where, you know, unfortunately we look at them and we're like, oh, maybe we'll see how this goes. We're not sure if you're going to be up for this. And they nail it and knock it out of the park. So it's definitely trainable. I think a lot of what we've found is that instead of looking at their, you know, body type, morphology, things like that, training experience and coachability is really the biggest factor in perfecting this in the AJSM.
Because it's more about, and again, jump in and correct my ignorance at any point. Because it's more about, like, right, you're trying to contract to keep the blood, like, up in the brain, right? So that's the most important kind of factor in that.
So there's two. So there's a full body, essentially, well, not full body, it's a lower body isometric contraction where you're really trying to dig your heels in, activate your hamstrings and glutes, and then essentially you're planking out your lower abs to keep that out. And then that all comes in combination with trying not to put your shoulders up, which the G's for fighter cockpits are pushing head to toe, so your natural instinct is to try to resist. So you have to learn to tighten your lower body while relaxing your upper body, which for a lot of people can be very difficult. Those are those stress symptoms that people maybe don't even realize that they naturally will start to cringe. And then all of that gets combined with a breathing maneuver. So on top of making sure that you're tight in the right places and loose in the right places, they are doing a breathing maneuver where they're loading the air, ideally in their lower abdomen where they're planking, and then they're essentially doing a Valsalva where they're closing the glottis, and every 3 seconds they're doing a very quick air exchange to keep that pressure off the heart and allow the heart to beat and everything to circulate. And yeah, all of that is meant to, as you mentioned, keep blood flow at the head so that they can see and maintain consciousness.
So kind of on topic, but a little bit. Like, have you seen the new Top Gun?
Yes.
Okay, so how? I mean, hey, you know, you're the only expert we've had on here who could say this because you see him in the movie, you know, like. So was that realistic?
Yeah.
Did they nail it?
It was pretty good.
Pretty good as a physiologist.
They did a good job, and I don't know how it was filmed. We've talked about it a lot, but no, I thought they did a good job, and it's fun for me to see because that's the interesting thing about the difference between the centrifuge we have and being in the cockpit is the centrifuge we have is you're training, nobody's trying to shoot you, you just have to sit there and, you know, kind of focus on yourself. Once we train our research subjects, then we'll give them a flight tracking task and maybe they'll have to, you know, shoot a bandit or something like that. But for the most part, they get to focus on themselves. As you see in Top Gun, they're trying to do this strain and breathe and look around and change their direction.
Yes.
And all of those G-forces going on the neck and things like that. A lot of the times it's not as perfect in real life as we train them to do, and I mean obviously that translates to the exercise, nutrition world, everything else. We've all experienced that, but that is the extreme of watching, because we can get people nice and comfortable, put towels behind their necks if we need to, things like that, because we want research to be as comfortable as possible. But yeah, they don't get that in the cockpit, and it's definitely an interesting strain.
Yeah, imagine. It's definitely one thing doing this, you know, purely kind of physiological tasks in a controlled environment, but then when you add all these layers, you know, I just read a paper, it's kind of like that with like marksmanship, right? You can lay down and you can, you know, look and zero and it's all nice and good, but they did this simulation, I think it was out of Korea, where they had the individual shooting back at a, they were actually like receiving fire in the simulation, and lo and behold, their marksman scores got worse.
Right.
It's kind of that factors like when you add stress to it. So yeah, I imagine when you add all those factors, it becomes a lot more challenging.
Yes.
With that. What about altitude? What are kind of some of the, I don't know, if you heard any like myths or things out there about altitude that you as a aerospace physiologist working with these chambers every day, you're just kind of like, no, that's not true.
I mean, everybody athletic thinks they're gonna, my O2, I won't get hypoxic, we can all climb Everest kind of thing. And obviously that's not true. It comes down a lot more to your genetics and just your build. Absolutely not a willpower or fault thing. So I think what happens a lot in the altitude chamber is we get that bravado of I'm fine, and things like that. But the problem with altitude is it's insidious, and it can be quite, most people will feel if they're getting hypoxic, is they'll start to feel nice, essentially, kind of warm and fuzzy, doze, goofy, etc. And especially those symptoms, you start to feel kind of cozy, and then all of a sudden their memory will be gone and their ability to respond will kind of just very quickly halt and cut off. So with that bravado, you get that very short amount of time to say, no, actually, you need to fix that. And that's a lot of the reason that they do altitude chamber training. And now the services have primarily gone over to reduced oxygen breathing devices because it is risky to train in the chamber. But in our opinion, and my opinion, you want to train as realistically as possible. Mm-hmm. So while there is risk for those pressure changes, I mean, the pressure changes, you're not just have lower oxygen density, and the hypoxia is not just the risk. It actually changes your breathing dynamics, things going on. So there's a lot more happening than just a lack of oxygen. And with that, I think a lot of what we see most often is people coming in and saying, I got this, and aren't really willing to let themselves correct. And that's really what we want to teach you is when do you correct and put yourself back on oxygen, and understanding this are my one or two symptoms, that's a red flag. Even if I'm doing something else, let me fix it. Or, if the pilot has to dive the plane to get to a lower altitude.
Yeah, I imagine that's difficult to train, but it's great to do it in that controlled environment, to have that opportunity to, in case they do go past that edge, when they, I guess, when they regain consciousness, you can tell them, you should have.
It's definitely interesting. We'll have video. We try not to get anybody to that point,
right.
But especially with operational crews, we'll let them have a little bit more leeway, because the goal there is not only to get the person that's in the hypoxia demo to understand their symptoms, so their crew understands how to recognize it in others, and that they can help each other out. So we'll video it, and there's lots of times where you'll hear somebody go, I don't remember that at all, or I don't remember that happening. But it becomes a very clear with hypoxia, where essentially one of the things we'll do is have them use the kid's toy. You put the star in the star, you put the square in the square. And so they're holding this kid's toy, having fun, putting stuff in off mask at altitude. And then all of a sudden you'll just see them stop. And it's just a pause, and their eyes are open, and they'll start to get, the lack of oxygen will start to interfere with their motor control. You'll start to see a little twitch, and at that point, generally they don't remember, and we'll mask them up. Ideally, we mask them up earlier, but again, sometimes depending on the conditions and the populations we're working with, we'll let them experience a little bit of that, and then we'll debrief with the video so that everybody understands the risks and things involved.
So that's I imagine though that's kind of a one-time thing, because I would imagine so if you're that individual and you see yourself on screen doing something and you have no recollection of it, I mean, is that kind of like after that they're good, or is there sometimes you got to train them a little more to?
I think after that they're good, or after that they decide, maybe this isn't job I thought it was. But yeah, it's definitely about recognizing. And I think in those training situations, again, you can push it a little bit more because you do have somebody, you have an instructor sitting next to you that's on 100% oxygen with no risk of being affected that is going to help you. But it does put into perspective what can happen and how quickly it can happen when you're in the aircraft.
When they're in those situations, are you monitoring, SpO2, everything? Like, can you see all that physiologically? I mean, do you kind of see that before it happens, or?
Yeah, generally, we'll monitor whoever's on trial. With our subjects, with research subjects, the criteria gets a lot more strict. We have certain SpO2 percentage cutoffs that if they're below for a certain amount of time, they're automatically back on oxygen, whether they're responsive or not. We'll ask for, we try to talk to you the whole time, get you to report your symptoms, tell us what's going on, get you to actually reflect on what's happening. In some conditions, not so much for the hypoxia demos, but when we do rapid decompression training, they always have an EKG just because the sudden change in pressure could, bring out an arrhythmia that we weren't expecting and things like that. So we absolutely do monitor, and there's always a medical monitor on the outside ready to call them down. And that's part of my role and my team's role as aerospace physiologists, is that safety component, is to be that voice to say, okay, this is, what we need to do, because there's a lot of risks with the pressure changes. There's ear and sinus blocks that can happen, gastrointestinal issues, different pains, all on top of, the hypoxia and the other things we're trying to bring about.
And this is all too, I mean, they've got to pass the physical. I mean, just to reiterate, like, there's so many safety checks going into this, right, to get to that level. Yeah, what is, can you say, is there something that occurs at altitude? Most people think of the out of breath and, those, maybe the altitude sickness. Is there something that occurs that kind of most people don't think about or consider, that you've seen over the years? You're like, oh, I never would have, until I had this job, been like, this what happens at altitude?
I think a lot of people, they think it's obvious. There's a definite, I think for me, a factor of being tired after. I describe, everybody's symptoms are different. The lucky ones are the people who have the symptoms that tell you something's wrong. Some people get nauseous and things like that, so they hate it. I describe my symptoms as it was like being wine drunk, everything's very warm. You're just like, oh, that's fun, that's nice, etc. So I think it comes back to a lot of people think, oh, I'll know. And, you don't. You just kind of slip into it. There are other people who will get belligerent. I'm definitely curious to see, a form, drinking creates a form of hypoxia. I'd be very interested to see a study where you could see if the people who are angry drunks are angry hypoxics.
Oh, yeah, that would be.
People who are, if there's a connection there.
Yeah,
as well.
so that might be the new, military, that you've got a mission at altitude. You're like, all right, we're going to go out drinking tonight. We're not taking you. We're leaving you behind.
Yeah, just a little scanning session.
No, that is fascinating. So with that, is there any now, are we like genetic testing going on, like pre altitude? Are there any like certain markers that's like that you can say, hey, if this person has this SNP or whatever, that they shouldn't go to altitude?
No, nothing that specific. There's always a balance, there's a lot of pilot shortages and then influxes, so that definitely plays a role. There is no altitude gene that is currently screened. They look a lot at high mountain populations and things like that, and with the Tibetans and all of those different populations, but the military really only will look at, sickle cell, things that are clearly going to mess up your oxygen delivery naturally, make sure your lung capacity, everything is functioning properly.
And do you look at that in terms of, with like lung capacity, or I'm thinking like VO2 max, because you said you've got some exercise testing. Do you have VO2 max and you look at that, or do individuals higher VO2 max typically do better? Or?
That would be awesome to find out. I don't personally know that. I'm sure a lot of the research on, train high,
Yeah.
sleep low would elucidate some of that. But for the pilot population, it's interesting. They get a lot of screening in some aspects, and then not a lot in maybe others that people coming from our background would expect. It's still, the community's still a lot more traditional. You get your chest x-ray, lungs look good, you can pass a physical, and that's kind of where it stops. Where what's interesting and very true is that pilots, a lot of the emphasis is on their ability to focus and make good decisions and in all of these conditions. But personally, I find that there's not as much of a human performance aspect the way that exercise and nutrition have expanded so much in the past years throughout the different branches. It's difficult to implement that in the pilot population. So they're still really focusing on just, can you think, can you do this, are you good, instead of how do we optimize your body to do this. It's more focused on the mind.
Gotcha. And I mean, that makes sense to start. But yeah, it's nice to see the expanded. And I do think, I know the Air Force, I'm going to butcher it, but they kind of have their holistic health and fitness teams. I'm starting to see some dietitians pop up working with pilots now, which I think's definitely, to your point, a step in the right direction. Besides pilots, any other groups that you work with that use the altitude chamber?
Currently, not much. There might be one-off different things that we didn't expect. Like during COVID, we got some calls to test some medical equipment, ventilators. Medical equipment is a primary subsection that we work on, making sure that ECMO for CaseVac and all those things are operational as they design new equipment, see how that all works. We'll actually be doing some of that testing in the Centrifuge soon as well, which will be really interesting. See how higher Gs than the helicopter, if your IV drips and things still actually can perform to the specificity that they need to. Because it's my understanding we're looking at a lot higher G transportation in the future, potentially. Yeah. But for that, I think a lot of it, I mean, the Air Force knows that where we are because that's where they left us. And the Navy knows where we are because of that. But in terms of working out, especially with, Army thermal, things like that, it's limited, definitely.
Okay. So that. And then for the environmental chamber, what's most of the work there? Is it more for equipment specs, or are there some human specs there that you're doing?
There's definitely human specs there. I'll be honest with you, sometimes it's utilized more because of the space. We have a cockpit, a mock U2 cockpit that we actually put people in for one of our studies. Is they get to sit in this cockpit for 12 hours. So with that, a lot of that will get done in that chamber. It allows more space for the equipment, things like that. That's what we're doing currently. In the past, I know they've had, trainings, full units can come in and practice whatever needs to be practiced in that chamber. Like I said, in the past, I know they've rolled in much larger equipment. We do have the treadmill and the heat lamps as well. We'd really like to expand the thermal and the different opportunities, and we're still working on that. Our next venture into that research-wise will be a study looking at high-altitude, low-opening jumps and trying to simulate that with the chamber to in two different conditions, and to look at a cold exposure and how that affects cognitive abilities after the, during and after the jump. Can they still think about at the top right before they jump what's going on when all of a sudden you get washed with cold? Is there any issues there, or versus just a normal temperature environment?
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That sounds exciting. And then you always start off with this, like with normal participants. You're recruiting in the San Antonio area, or for something like that, would that be a Halo qualified individuals?
No, yeah, because they don't actually have to jump, right? They just get exposed to the free fall. So no, that's where it is really cool, and I get the opportunity to lead that recruitment effort. And what we do is anybody across JBSA, we prefer local just because you can come in and it's not that hard. We don't have to deal with TDYs, things like that. And generally, we actually use non-pilot, non-jump populations. A lot of our subjects are right now are construction, cyber, some EOD, and they'll just come in and say, I want to learn how to be in the altitude chamber, I want to pull G's, and we train them for that. And that's part of why being local helps. Everybody takes different times to get to that training point, and we work with their schedule and their TDYs and whatever's going on to work through that. But it gives a lot of people with different jobs, we even have a subject that's in the Air Force band, with different jobs to come and experience this side of essentially the Air Force, or what the pilots are doing, and they get fitted for all their equipment. They get trained to do work with different oxygen systems, to pull G's in different ways for different aircrafts and things like that. So they get the full experience, and then they get to choose what research projects after they're trained that they want to participate in. So if anything seems a little too dicey, you get to say no. But most of them have already kind of been drank the Kool-Aid, and are ready to go for whatever we're going to throw at them.
Wow.
Yeah.
So how do people find out about these studies? Like, how do you recruit, or is there anything we can do to throw up a link or whatever if people are listening and interested in this?
Yeah, absolutely. That would be awesome. That is kind of where a lot of it comes from. As you can imagine, recruiting within the military has its own special restrictions.
Yep.
I can't recruit in front of command or anything, which severely limits. So usually we reach out to the private orgs, the top 3, the career services. They've been really nice to us, and they help us out a lot. And essentially it comes down to us trying to talk to different audiences, handing out flyers and word of mouth to our subjects to say, hey, tell your friends what you're doing, as long as you like it, and get everybody to come on in.
Yeah, we'll have to do that, get a link, because I didn't even know this existed. I'd been stationed here before, and I think, there'd be a lot of soldiers interested in doing this, especially this type of work. Any other kind of things on the aerospace physiology horizon that you think maybe that you can talk about, obviously, and that folks would want to know about?
Yeah, I think the sensor development is definitely going to be expansive, and I think a lot of integration is going to go into almost creating pilots into cyborgs and aircrew. We've looked at everything from patches to shirts to a whole different expanse. A lot of times we think of sensors and we think of big chunky clips or patches, but they are really working on streamlining it, incorporating them into the helmets, things like that, so that there's full monitoring, full data, kind of creating a black box for the pilot themselves to see what's happening. And there's some YouTube videos out there where the pilots have commented, maybe they want a snack and they're not supposed to be off mask. Well, now they can see that data when they land and get yelled at, because you don't want to be off mask at high altitude in case something happens, but everybody's got their own.
You gotta fuel, you gotta eat. Exactly. I get it. I'm with you, pilots.
Everybody's got their own thing. You can't just drop altitude because you want a cracker. But so a lot of those components, I think, will bring maybe some lifestyle or operational just human integration factors that maybe we don't think or talk about a lot, that the community does, to see how that can work. I think the full-time monitoring might bring up a lot more questions and issues, but my personal hope, and hopefully we'll have a couple studies coming soon, is expanding that human performance and fueling the body aspect for that community. Hopefully they'll start to get on board the way the other services have, and I know there's a desire to, it's just the demand of their job doesn't quite incorporate it just yet. So
yeah, a lot of demands on them, to be fair, but obviously I'm biased as a dietitian, but
Right.
I am with you 100%, and that, you know, ways to optimally fuel those pilots and look at that, and hopefully we can in the future. Is there anywhere, we'll get the link for your program to recruit.
Yeah.
For you personally, is there anywhere folks can find you or your work or things you do?
Yeah, absolutely. LinkedIn is always a good aspect. I can provide my email as well, and phone number. I'm pretty open to talking to everybody and anybody, whether they want to participate or just ask questions, or for people who are interested in what the hell aerospace physiology is.
Yes, no, thank you, Bria. I really appreciate you coming on here. Say we just met a couple weeks ago, and I think it was, you know, via LinkedIn. You reached out, and
Yep.
it, you know, it's turned into this great conversation. And I love the work that you're doing, and hopefully soon I'm going to come over there and test it. You know, I want to see that human centrifuge. I don't know any of the crew. Would you guys get in there? I'll film you if you go in the human centrifuge.
Oh, you can definitely come in. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe we could do an on-site. You know, we bring some of to see some of this stuff.
That would be a lot of fun.
That would be a lot
I
of
think
fun
we can do that.
going through. But thanks so much for coming again. Really appreciate
Yeah,
your time.
thank you again.
And again, thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Fuel the Fight. Really appreciate it, and hopefully got a lot out of it. And we'll have Bria's contact info in the show notes.